The Vatican gardens were silent that morning, save for the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of early prayers. Pope Francis walked alone, his white cassock stark against the greenery, hands clasped behind his back. At 78, his steps were slower than they once had been, but his eyes remained sharp, missing nothing. On his desk back inside lay a letter that had kept him awake for 3 nights straight. It had arrived without diplomatic fanfarino embossed seal, no formal delegation, just a simple envelope with handwriting that sloped slightly to the right. The return address, Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. The sender, Ibrahim Traoré. The youngest head of state in Africa had written directly to the oldest institution on earth, and his words had landed like stones in still water. Your Holiness, the letter had begun, I write not with the polished words of diplomats, but with the raw truth of a son of African soil. What followed were 15 pages of unflinching history, painful questions, and a challenge that cut to the heart of the Church's relationship with Africa, relationship built on centuries of complicity, silence, and unacknowledged wounds. As Francis walked, fragments of Traoré's words echoed in his mind. How can the Church speak of justice while our resources leave in ships and return as debt? How can Rome preach dignity while our artifacts sit in your museums? How can Christ's representatives bless governments that were selected in foreign capitals? The Pope paused beside a stone bench, his hand resting on its sun-warmed surface. Traoré's letter had done something rare. It had troubled his sleep, not with anger, but with recognition. The young captain had written things many thought but few dared say, especially to the head of the Catholic Church. Francis had spent the past 3 days praying, reading histories he'd been taught to skip, and consulting not just with his cardinals but with African priests who served in Roma men, whose perspectives had been politely sidelined for too long. He sat on the bench, feeling the weight of his years and his office. What Traoré had written wasn't just a diplomatic correspondence, it was a moral reckoning. And Francis knew he had to respond not just with words, but with truth. 5,000 miles away, in a modest office in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré stood at the window, watching the early morning bustle of his capital city. Street vendors were setting up, children in uniform walked to school, motorbikes weaved through traffic with practiced precision. Still no response? Asked Commandant Ouattara, who had entered silently with a stack of security briefings. Traoré shook his head. It's been almost 3 weeks. Perhaps I was too direct. Ouattara snorted. You were honest. That's what makes powerful men uncomfortable. The Pope isn't just a powerful man, Traoré said quietly. He's a shepherd, or at least he's supposed to be. At 34, Traoré carried himself with the gravity of someone much older. The weight of a nation rested on shoulders that had already borne the weight of combat, coups, and crushing international pressure. He had not sought power, but had stepped into the void when his country needed leadership, guided by the same principles his grandmother had taught him under the mango tree behind their home. Always speak truth, she had told him, even when truth is not welcome, especially when it is not welcome. So he had written to the Pope not in anger, but in hope, not in accusation, but in invitation. An invitation to acknowledge what had been stolen, what had been justified, what had been buried beneath centuries of theological rationalization. The letter hadn't been his idea initially. It was born during a late-night conversation with a village elder who'd asked him a simple question. If you could speak to one person who might actually change how the world sees Africa, who would it be? Traoré had answered without hesitation, the Pope. Not because he was Catholic, but because the Church's moral authority still shaped how much of the world thought about justice, dignity, and human worth. If that moral lens could be cleansed of colonial residue, perhaps the way the world saw Africa might finally begin to change. So he had written, pouring out centuries of accumulated truth in pages that came not just from history books but from the lived reality of his people. Maybe it was foolish, Traoré murmured, more to himself than to Ouattara. One letter can't change centuries of... A sharp knock interrupted him. His assistant entered with an unusual expression, something between awe and disbelief. Mr. President, she said, there's a call for you, from Vatican City. The Vatican switchboard operators had never patched through a direct call from the Pope to an African head of state. The protocol office had nearly had a collective seizure when Francis announced his intention, bypassing diplomatic channels, embassy briefings, and the careful choreography that typically surrounded papal communications. Direct? Francis had insisted. No intermediaries, just 2 men speaking truth. Now, his hands slightly tremulous with age but steady in purpose, Francis held the receiver as the connection was established. Captain Traoré? he said when the line connected. "This is Francis." There was a pause, then a voice younger than he expected, with the faint accent of someone who had learned French in African classrooms rather than European ones. "Your Holiness, I didn't expect a call." Francis smiled slightly. "No, I imagine you expected a carefully worded letter, perhaps drafted by my Secretary of State, full of diplomatic niceties and cautious acknowledgments." Another pause. "That would have been the usual protocol. I've read your letter 3 times, Captain Traoré. You didn't write with protocol in mind. Your words deserve more than a diplomatic response." The line hummed with silence, the silence of thousands of miles and centuries of complicated history. "I'm listening," Traoré said finally. Francis took a deep breath. "Your letter spoke of wounds inflicted by colonization, by economic exploitation, by cultural theft, by the complicity of religious institutions, including my own church." "Yes. Before I respond in writing which I wanted to tell you directly, you are right. The silence that followed was profound. The church has been complicit," Francis continued. "We have blessed what should have been condemned. We have remained silent when we should have shouted. We have turned away when we should have stood between the powerful and the vulnerable." "These are not easy words for you to say," Traoré observed quietly. "No easier than the truths you wrote to me, but necessary. Without truth, there can be no healing. Without acknowledgement, there can be no justice. And without justice, there can be no real peace," Traoré finished. "Exactly." Francis paused. "Captain Traoré, I'm not calling just to acknowledge the past. I'm calling to speak about the future. I would like to come to Burkina Faso." The silence that followed was electric. "To Ouagadougou?" Traoré finally asked. "Yes. Not for a standard papal visit with masses and stadiums and meetings with dignitaries. I want to come and listen. To you, to your elders, to your youth. To hear directly what the church needs to understand about Africa's experience, Africa's wisdom, Africa's spirituality. That would be unprecedented." "So was your letter," Francis said with a small chuckle. "Sometimes unprecedented is exactly what we need." The news of the Pope's planned visit to Burkina Faso exploded across global media. Speculation ran wild. Was this a diplomatic coup for Traoré? A strategic move by the Vatican to counter growing Russian and Chinese influence in West Africa? A genuine spiritual pilgrimage or a political maneuver? What few knew was that both men had agreed to something radical. No prepared speeches, no policy announcements, no performative gestures for the cameras. Just honest dialogue, beginning with 3 days in Ouagadougou but extending to villages rarely visited by foreign dignitaries, much less the head of the Catholic Church. "They'll try to control this," Ouattara warned Traoré as they reviewed security arrangements. "The Vatican has PR people just like every other power. They'll want photo ops, carefully staged moments." Traoré nodded. "So do our own people. Everyone wants to script history instead of simply letting it unfold." "And if they insist?" Traoré looked up from the papers. "Then we'll remember that he is coming to our home, not the other way around. In Burkina Faso, we greet guests with honor, but we don't surrender our dignity to make them comfortable." When the papal plane touched down at Ouagadougou International Airport 2 weeks later, the usual red carpet was absent. There was no military band, no line of bishops, no carefully orchestrated ceremony. Instead, as Francis descended the steps, he found only Traoré waiting, dressed not in a formal suit, but in a simple, elegant bubu made from local cloth. "Welcome to Burkina Faso," Traoré said, extending his hand. "You've had a long journey." Francis took the younger man's hand, studying his face. Intelligence, caution, and a guarded hope looked back at him. "Not nearly as long as the journey that brought us to this moment," the Pope replied. Traoré's expression softened slightly. "True. That journey has been centuries in the making." As they walked toward the waiting Carnot, a bulletproof limousine, but a modest SUV, Francis gestured to the lack of ceremony. "I expected more. Formality." Traoré allowed himself a small smile. "I thought we agreed to set aside the scripts, Your Holiness. Besides, the real welcome isn't here. It's waiting for you in the heart of my country." What happened over the next 7 days transformed not just the relationship between the Vatican and Burkina Faso, but began a seismic shift in how the Church engaged with the entire African continent. The carefully planned schedule dissolved within hours. When Francis expressed interest in visiting a rural village mentioned in Traoré's letter, the young president simply redirected their motorcade bypassing a planned meeting with Catholic officials in favor of a bumpy 2-hour drive to a place called Kongusi. There, beneath an ancient baobab tree, village elders welcomed not the Pope of Rome, but a fellow elder, a man with white hair who had come to listen. For 4 hours, as the African sun climbed and then began its descent, Francis sat on a wooden stool, hearing stories that had never been written in Vatican archives. An 86-year-old woman, her face mapped with wrinkles that told a century's history, recounted how her grandfather had been forced to build a church while his own children went hungry. A village imam described how Muslims and Christians had hidden each other during times of persecution, finding more unity in shared suffering than division in theology. A young teacher spoke of students who still learned that European civilization had been a gift to Africa, while their own ancestors' contributions to mathematics, medicine, and philosophy were footnotes at best. Francis listened without interruption, without defense, without the instinct to explain or justify. He simply absorbed, his eyes occasionally filling with tears that he made no effort to hide. When darkness fell and lamps were lit, he finally spoke not with prepared remarks, but with the raw honesty of someone whose understanding had been fundamentally altered. "The Church has called itself universal," he said quietly, "but we have too often confused universality with uniformity. We have too often mistaken our European expression of faith for the only legitimate expression." This was not just a cultural arrogance, it was a theological error. A murmur passed through the gathered villagers. These were not the words of a careful diplomat, but of a man grappling aloud with profound revelation. "Christ did not come to make all people Roman," Francis continued. "He came to redeem all cultures, all expressions of human dignity. When we tried to make Africa European in order to make it Christian, we betrayed the very gospel we claimed to preach." Traoré, who had remained silent throughout, studied the Pope's face in the lamplight. This was not performance. This was transformation happening in real time. The following days unfolded with similar departures from protocol. In a Ouagadougou hospital, Francis washed the feet of patients not as a ceremonial gesture, but as a genuine act of service that left him visibly exhausted. In a meeting with economic advisors, he listened as they detailed how international loans and resource contracts systematically stripped Africa's wealth while creating the illusion of aid. In each place, the pattern was the same. Francis listened more than he spoke, asked questions rather than offering answers, and repeatedly acknowledged the Church's historical complicity in systems that had wounded Africa. On the 5th day, something unexpected happened. After visiting a school where children performed traditional dances alongside Catholic hymns sung in local languages, Francis turned to Traoré. "I need to see where you come from," he said quietly. "Not the presidential palace, your home." Traoré hesitated. His family's compound in his home village was a private place, far from the capital, not part of any official itinerary. "It's very simple," he warned. "Nothing like the Vatican." Francis's eyes crinkled. "That might be precisely why I need to see it." And so, with minimal security and no media, they traveled to the small village where Traoré had been born, a collection of homes built from earth and wood, where chickens scratched in dusty yards and children played with homemade toys. Traoré's elderly mother, initially overwhelmed by the presence of the Pope, soon treated him like any other guest, insisting he eat from the communal bowl and laughing when he struggled with the technique. Under the same mango tree where Traoré had listened to his grandmother's wisdom as a boy, the two men sat as the day cooled into evening. "This is where I learned what matters," Traoré said simply, gesturing to the humble surroundings. "Not in military academies or presidential offices. Here." Francis nodded. "I understand now why you wrote that letter. You carry this place with you, even in Ouagadougou. Even when facing the powers that would prefer Burkina Faso, remain obedient to foreign interests. Just as you carry Flores with you, even in Rome," Traoré replied, referencing the Pope's birthplace in Argentina. "Even when surrounded by those who would prefer the Church, remain a European institution with African branches rather than truly universal."